Most fictional rebellions are boring. Usually they are like a ride through a theme park of generic cliches and made to tick certain boxes. Evil empire oppressing people? Check. Good rebels that can do no wrong? Check. A mustache-twirling villain representing the oppressor? Check. However, rebellions can be an amazing writing tool to explore your world building, your characters, and they can be a source of a lot of conflicts and drama. So in this video, I will show you how to make timeless, complex rebellions with stakes, with depth and purpose in your story. And let us start with the first step, how rebellions actually start. The fundament of every rebellion is a motive, a cause. In all countries and societies, there will always be groups of people who are just not happy with the current state of things. The reason you don't have rebellions all the time is that there are some fundamentals that needs to be laid out first for a groundwork for a greater rebellion. The first bedrock is the strength of the motive. No matter how much you dislike your current situation and no matter how not happy you are with the current price of bread or the rampant crime and corruption, you won't really do much about it unless it will directly and very strongly impact you. Because what you need to understand, we are talking about rebellions, about a violent uprising against the current power. You might do some things to prevent those problems, but unless it's not too bad, then why risk your own life? Why risk your own livelihood, your local community? Because a violent uprising against a greater power is a very risky thing to do. So the motive, the cause, need to be so strong that people will be willing to potentially sacrifice their own life, their own families and their own local communities to achieve whatever they are trying to achieve. The second bedrock is the area of discontent. Because you might have a very strong motive. You might have your local community that not only supports you, but they also want to join arms with you. You have a stockpiles of weapons ready. You have a stock of young fighting age males to take up arms with you against the greater power. But your rebellious community is just 0.1% of the entire population of this giant empire. No, you are not getting independence, at least not through violent means. And even if you feel suicidal and you actually want to start that rebellion, it will be very, very quickly crushed. And the last third bedrock is the game of chances. Even with a very strong motive and a very widespread support for your rebellion, if you do not feel and do not see that you can actually win against a greater power, even if those people are very willing to do so, they won't actually do it because they will not really feel that you can succeed. You see, the reason why oppressive regimes can last for a very long time without any massive rebellions is that they will very often have a big military presence almost anywhere, and they will actively crack down any signs of even mild discontent, which can and will crush any fighting spirits and any spark of rebellion that can potentially arise. Now, after those three bedrocks have been laid down, you have a strong motive which is widespread enough to have any chance of winning, and people actually believe that they can win. The first thing that happens for a rebellion to start is the catalyst. Usually that means one event, something that will push people to say enough and rebel. Of course, it doesn't mean that this one event is the cause of the entire rebellion. It only means that this one event is the straw that breaks the camel's back. A great historical example of that is in the American War for Independence. Officially, the imposition of the Tea Act from 1773 was the tipping point that caused the War for Independence 2 years later in 1775, and it led to the Boston Tea Incident. The reason why this event is treated as the beginning, even though the war has actually started 2 years later, is that this was the tipping point, the catalyst, when the Americans finally said enough and acted against the British oppression of the American colonies. Then in the span of those 2 years, it just escalated more and more into a open rebellion, open war. Another great example can be the Spartacus revolt, where after years of harsh conditions and mistreatment led to the escape of Spartacus and his fellow gladiators into the mountains. Initially there were only a couple dozen of gladiators and they were very poorly armed in the beginning. But as time went on, other slaves and oppressed people started to join his revolt, and at the very peak of the revolt it turned into an army of at least 40,000 people that managed to decimate a couple of Roman legions before they were finally put down. And all of that bloodshed and destruction and this entire war was only because a couple dozen gladiators just said enough and decided to run away. All rebellions have a source. No matter how small, it always starts from, well, something. And the motive, the cause of the rebellion is not always natural. Sometimes the spark of discontent can come from other places. The rise of a revolt or a rebellious movement and their motive can generally be attributed to at least 2, sometimes more, out of 4 directions. Internal direction, originating from within the country's own borders or region. External, driven by influences from outside the country, such as a neighboring nation, for example. Top-down, initiated by the upper echelons of the society, often by politicians, aristocrats, or the ruling class. And grassroots, emerging from the everyday people directly affected by the cause. I know it might sound confusing, but let me show you a couple of examples to make it easier to understand. The Spartacus revolt we discussed earlier, for example, was a grassroots internal rebellion, initiated by the lower class, by the common people, that is why grassroots, and the source of the rebellion, the source of the miscontent and their motive was internal, from the inside of the Roman Empire. However, the War of Spanish Succession in 1701 can be seen as a top-down external rebellion. I'm talking specifically about the Catalonian Revolt, which was heavily influenced by the British Empire and the Dutch Republic, who sought to prevent the unification of Spain. It was top-down because it came from nobility, and external because it was not Spanish nobility, it was British and Dutch nobility, but not only, however, it was sparked by them. Of course, just because a rebellion started a certain way doesn't mean that in the middle of the rebellion the source of the motive can actually change. The French Revolution of 1789 is a great example of a top-down internal rebellion that evolved and changed in the course of it into a grassroots rebellion. It started from a political push to limit the king's absolute power and push for political reforms in France during that time. However, if you are familiar with the French Revolution, you know that it very quickly spiraled out of control and it became a grassroots rebellion, a rebellion coming from the common people. They started to control the waves of this revolt and very quickly heads started to roll. The next step in designing your own fictional rebellions in your story are factions. Of course, like with any large group of people, naturally factions will start to emerge, people who think differently, and rebellions and revolts are no different. In any rebellion, you will always find people who not only will think that the rebellion should be done in a completely different way, but they will also disagree what should be the end goal of a rebellion. When designing your own internal fictional conflict, think about how united are the forces that fight against the greater power. While they might be allies for now against the common foe, they might start to disagree on certain things, and some of those factions might decide to seize the initiative, let's say, and after winning they might decide to just start purging other groups of rebels. Of course, some rebellions might be very straightforward and just have 2 opposing factions fighting each other. A great example of that is the American Civil War, where you just had the Unionists and the Confederates. You just had 2 factions fighting each other, and that was pretty much all. Whereas, for example, you might find a drastically different case. Currently, as the publishing of this video, there is a civil war going on in Burma/Myanmar. I don't know which one is correct. And if you actually look at the map of this conflict, there is so many factions, each fighting for some other goals and each having their own priorities. And sure, this is an extreme example, but it is an example that exists. It is real. In a region with a lot of different ethnicities and cultural minorities, it is very likely that the rebellion will start to spark everywhere and will be very fractured. Because one small group, even if they don't agree with the other group, might as well use the opportunity to rebel for their own cause. And in terms of storytelling and writing, factions can really help you as a writer to prolong that conflict and provide a rich opportunity to explore your world building in greater depth. Next step are stages of rebellion. Contrary to most wars, rebellions usually have a very strict, distinct stages of progression. The first one is usually ignition, the very beginning of the rebellion. This one is usually very energetic. People will finally rise against the greater power and they will feel the moment. The boiling point, the catalyst event finally exploded and people have this energy to go and then fight against the greater power. This is the first moment where the rebellion will start rising and spreading like wildfire. And of course, just like any wildfire, if someone reacts very quickly, it can be put down very quickly before it spreads too much. But without a fast reaction and without a contamination of this wildfire, the rebellion will spread very fast to other settlements, to other places. Different groups of people will see that the tides are changing and it's time to raise arms. The second stage I call the Tidebreaker. This is the middle stage of the rebellion and it is the critical point for the rebellion if it will actually succeed and it will actually continue, or it will be cracked down. In this stage of the rebellion, enough time has passed for the rebellion to spread where it could, but now the current power that the rebellion is aimed against will have also enough time to create and direct suppression forces to the region of that rebellion, and the actual civil war will start. Historically, most rebellions failed, and usually most rebellions would fail actually at this very moment, at the Tidebreaker moment. The moment where the current greater power that the rebellion is aimed against will have time to react and crack down this rebellion. Because after the spark of the wildfire from the very beginning, the energy that spread around of the rebellion will actually start to die down a little bit, because the initial wildfire that happened in the first stage, it will finally stop. And rebellions usually are made out of common people, and common people are usually not disciplined enough to continue on for a very long time. So the motivation and the energy will die down, and that is why most rebellions fail at this stage. The Spartacus revolt that we talked about previously was crushed exactly at that point. The rebellion spread like wildfire during the ignition phase and accumulated almost 40,000 people, but they started to lose steam. Factions started to create inside of that rebellion. Some wanted to run away from the Roman Empire, others wanted to attack Rome itself, others just wanted to pillage and plunder. The revolt started to bleed attrition, and the Roman Empire, after a couple of first losses, now had enough time to learn what they are up against and prepare accordingly. They very easily predicted the next move of the Spartacus forces, intercepted it, and then crushed it in an open battle. But that is not always the case with all rebellions, because the next stage is the longer game. If the rebellion is not concluded in the Tidebreaker stage, which most of them will, either losing mostly or succeeding in a very small occasions, then a very long, grueling guerrilla warfare and skirmishes will proceed. What will most likely happen in that stage is a very long stalemate, or a very slow advance of the regime forces against the rebel forces, or just an open warfare. Because there is a chance that the rebellion will manage to get strong enough and manage to push hard enough to create a foothold and oppose the current regime directly, but also at the same time, the regime will have time to react and create countermeasures for that, and you end up with a situation of the unmovable force facing unstoppable object or something like that. This is a point that you as a writer can do so many different things. It is a stage where the rebellion can go anywhere, and that is why it's very difficult to give a very general advice for this specific stage. I just wanted to describe what might be happening and what is the aftermath of those two previous stages. But the last stage is actually very rare in the rebellions, and if you're a new writer, someone who is not that experienced with writing, especially writing wars, I would not recommend prolonging your rebellions in your story to that stage. I would recommend leave it at the second stage. It will be easier for you as a writer. At least you will gain some more experience with writing down more complex conflicts. Now, with a general layout on how a fictional rebellion should be built, there are some common mistakes and pitfalls that you should be wary of that I very often see in fictional rebellion portrayals. One of them, and the most common one, is the black and white dichotomy. Usually it happens more often in fantasy stories. It's when you have one side, usually the rebels, who are portrayed as the universal good guys who can do no wrong and all they do is nice things, and only the regime is the evil bad guys that do all the bad things. Even if one side is clearly morally wrong, and you can portray them, that there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes to win, the quote-unquote good guys need to resort to do immoral things that are very pragmatic but morally ambiguous. That is why I love the show Andor, because the rebels in the Star Wars universe were always the universal good guys who can do no wrong. But in Andor, even if we have no doubts about the oppressiveness of the Empire, we see that the rebels need to do some questionable things. The rebels have no problem sacrificing the life of other rebels just to stay hidden.
ISB knows Krieger's plan. They'll be waiting for him.
And Krieger, he doesn't know. You're willing to burn him. 30 men.
Plus Krieger.
For the greater good.
Or purposefully allow for more oppression just to motivate people to rise up against the Empire.
The time has come to force their hand.
People will suffer.
That's the plan.
By the way, Andor is so well written, I highly recommend you to watch it. The next one is the universality of rebellions. I mentioned previously about factions, and I cannot stress how important that is. Factions appear in rebellions more often than not, and we very rarely see that in fiction. Usually it's 1v1 in any story that you are reading. But what about third parties? Let's say you have a rebellion against the current power, and the rebellion is about reinstating the rightful heir of the kingdom. But there is also another rebellion that happened that do not care at all about monarchy. Maybe they just do not want the king, they just want a republic, whatever. They want a different system of governance. And now, for example, if the rebellion will become more stagnant, the different factions and groups of the rebellions might start to negotiate with each other, to help each other, because if one rebellion will be crushed, the other one will soon follow. So one side can promise something to the other side, and then after they win, they might keep that promise or they might not. You can do a lot of drama, a lot of different conflicts along the way, but still keeping the main conflict as the main scope of your story. You can explore so many things, not only social and political things, but also characters. Let's say you write a great leader of a rebellion. Now, if he needs to negotiate with a different rebellion, you can explore his character to see how much is he willing to sacrifice and how much is he willing to compromise his own goals just to achieve his ultimate goals. And if you want to write down a top-down rebellion that actually starts from the nobility and the politics and out of a intrigue and not a grassroots rebellion like most writers do, you can check this video that I made about political intrigues and how they are formed, and you can mix those two together. And if you find this video useful and you want to work with me on your writing project personally, then you can check the first link in the description down below. And that's all for today. See you when I see you.